They were separated from Christ without hope and without God, but that through Christ they have been brought near, and that the dividing wall has been taken down, with the commandment abolished to make one new family, creating reconciliation and ending hostility. So if that doesn't speak to the issues of violence, especially in inner city, I don't know what scriptural verse doesn't. And so when I talk now about the middle wall, I'm going to be talking about what I believe are divisions and middle walls in the hearts of people when it comes to talking about violence and those who are impacted by violence. All right? So before I go into that, I want to also share a little bit about how significant this conference has been and the people and many of the priests in this room to my spiritual life, my family's life. So I counted 19 years ago, I found myself at Raphael House, and I was working there as a case manager and volunteered in the bookstore of Father Tom Alessandroni. And he and his matushka casually mentioned that they had this really good friend, Father Moses Berry, who created a connection between African American spirituality and Orthodox spirituality. And that name stuck in my head, and I had a deep desire to get to know him better if I ever had the chance to cross paths with him. Shortly after that encounter, I went to Albania with the Orthodox Christian Mission Center and was there for a while, and subsequently with the IOCC in Ethiopia. And when I came back to Chicago, where I was born and raised, I saw a flyer for Father Moses speaking at Holy Trinity OCA Cathedral. And I went to go speak to him after his lecture, and I shared with him about some of the experiences I had in Albania, and he invited me to come to the St. Moses the Black Conference, which at that year was in Ash Grove. And it was there that I met Father Alexi, then Father Paisius, who said, you should come to Kansas City and check out the work that we do. And that was pivotal for me because I knew I wanted to be a social worker, but I didn't see how I could merge my faith as an Orthodox Christian and do the community work that I cared about so deeply until I saw what Father Alexi had started in Kansas City and how it's been continued on. Few years later, as a social worker doing community violence interruption work, I met my husband. And we literally met on a street corner because he was doing gang intervention work, and I had just finished visiting with a family member of a homicide victim. And it was at that moment he said, do you think we should start a support group for family members of homicide victims because they don't have any support after they bury their children? And we said, yeah, I think this is a good idea. And it was through that collaboration that we got to know each other. 2 years later, we ended up getting married. But in that process, I was introducing him to Orthodoxy. And he came with me to different churches in Chicago and told me, this is one big ethnic country club. I have no interest in being part of it. And I was like, well, let me take you to Kansas City. And we went to visit Father Paisius at that time. And he said, you know, Matushka's having a family reunion in a park nearby. Why don't you guys come by and check it out? And so my husband, he wasn't my husband yet, but we went to this family reunion. And there, Matushka gave him a once-over and said, you're going to be Orthodox one day. And that's exactly what happened. About a few weeks before we got married, he was baptized, chrismated, baptized. We've been raising our family in the church. And our 7th child and our 6th daughter, Michaela, was named in honor of Archangel Michael, but in memory of Matushka Michaela. And we were so thankful that Father Alexi allowed us to have her baptism at his monastery. So the people in this room and the connections that I've made from Father Moses, Father Tom, and Father Alexi, and Matushka Michaela are at the spiritual cornerstone of our family's life. And so speaking of family life, we have 9 children now. And you've probably seen me scooting around with our 3-month-old son, Emmanuel, but we have 7 daughters and 2 sons. And my husband's in Washington, D.C. with our older 5 on a fall road trip, introducing them to some of our national monuments and museums. I have 2 in Chicago with my mother-in-law and brother-in-law who are visiting for the Chicago Marathon tomorrow. And I brought little Michaela with me, and I brought Emmanuel, our son. So clearly the spiritual cornerstone that's been laid in our marriage has borne much fruit, and hope that you will all keep them in your prayers, and especially their parents. So I want to bring you into the world of community violence intervention and prevention work. Or we call it CVI for short, community violence intervention work. So CVI work occurs in urban communities, in neighborhoods with the highest rates of gun violence, of shootings and homicides. All right, and what it involves is hiring what we call homegrown peacemakers or indigenous peacemakers, or people who were formerly involved in the streets, formerly systems impacted, to go out into the community and work within the relationships and networks that are at the epicenter of violence. So that usually involves gangs, all right, and gang outreach. I began doing community violence intervention work because I started off as a therapist, and I was doing community-based mental health care, and everybody that I worked with had been exposed to violence. They were coming to see me as a therapist because they saw violence in their home, in their community, in their schools, and it was deteriorating their well-being. So I thought, I'm gonna swim upstream and get at the root cause of why people are coming to see me as a therapist. And so I started getting involved in community violence intervention programs. My husband used to be a street outreach worker. And he came to that because he was once somebody who was at the epicenter of the problem, who was both impacted by violence and inflicted violence on others, all right? So community violence intervention workers use their past traumas to heal others as they are healing themselves. It's beautiful work. It does not involve engaging law enforcement, and it's harnessing the power of community and indigenous healers to prevent violence and also reach those who have lost complete hope in their own life and in the future of others in their community. Intertwined in community violence intervention work is working with the survivors of violence. So as I shared, I've been working with families of homicide victims for 16 years now, running support groups, but also working with groups of mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters who are seeking to make meaning of their loss through giving back to others, through healing their community, through mobilizing their community for resources for programs, for policy changes that could increase access to resources for survivors of violence, and overall seeking opportunities to reconcile with those who have caused harm to them or to their children. So it is incredible work. It is incredible work, but it is very painful work. And as you see here, these bricks that you see on the top right-hand side of the screen, these are names of young people who've been murdered in Chicago. There's a mother I know on the south side of Chicago who runs an organization called Kids Off the Block. For every child that's murdered in Chicago, she writes their name on a brick, and she has an altar in her backyard, which now she's open to the public. It's an open memorial to use the lives lost as a way to provoke public consciousness of what are we doing about this to protect our children? What are we doing to heal families in the aftermath? But also to let the families know that your children did not die in vain, that their memory is eternal in our neighborhood, and we will remember them and do our best to prevent this from ever happening to another family. So I know that there's some in this room that know street outreach work. I know that Father Paul does street outreach work with a neighborhood resilience project. But for those who may be like, this sounds cool, but what does it actually look like, and what is the landscape of this? When I'm talking to different groups, I found that the following clip that I'm about to play gives the best, I think, portrayal of the deep bereavement that exists in these communities for lives lost due to violence and their desire to heal from it. So I'm going to play this brief clip. Let's see if I can pull this up without too much awkwardness. Okay. And this comes from a documentary called The Interrupters that was produced by the same producer of Hoop Dreams, if anybody likes sports documentaries. And what he did was he followed 3 outreach workers in Chicago, one of them who ended up being my husband, and what they did in the community to respond to violence, to heal those in the aftermath of violence, and to create peace. And so this is just a montage of bereavement in Chicago that I believe is an opportunity for us Orthodox Christians for our prayers and for our healing and for our presence. So. see as clearly, but that brick wall was a memorial, again, a public memorial of those who had lost their lives to violence, and there was a brick on there that said, "I am next." And so that is the landscape in which outreach workers, in which social service workers, which a lot of people are trying to stop, we call stop the bleed, stop violence. But what I see as an Orthodox Christian in this are open altars, a massive bereavement, and a desire to hold the lives of those lost in their eternal memories, so that, again, it's a call for healing, but also that they want their loved ones to be commemorated. And they're everywhere you drive in Chicago, and especially on the west and south sides, you see these open altars. This exists, but in every city, though. It exists in Indianapolis, it exists in Pittsburgh, it exists in Kansas City. And so I can tell you, I'll start by saying, what are we doing as an Orthodox, or what am I doing in these spaces? What's the work happening? And then situate within that what I believe is the Orthodox potential here, at least in Chicago. And I know that the Orthodox Church is involved in this in other cities. So this presentation concludes with a request for your prayers for this work to be made manifest in Chicago. So the work that I've done through nonprofits and through the Attorney General's office is to first increase investments in community-based services so that you can have more of these homegrown peacemakers reaching out to people in the community, seeking to heal them and support them in the aftermath. I was asked by our mayor, Brandon Johnson, to help lead the Public Safety Transition Committee heading in the summer of 2023. As we're looking at, we know in summertime violence, crime rates usually spike in Chicago, but also looking at what are the responses that currently exist from law enforcement, from the criminal legal system, and to what extent are these ensuring safety and healing for all of those who've been impacted. There's two resources that I've developed in case anyone here is in social services. That there's a website that I developed called Street Support, which is how do organizations center the wellness of their workers and trauma responsive care for those who are doing community-based care work. And then the Illinois Survivors website is I look through all of the policy in our state that's intended to support survivors, but people usually aren't walking around with a legal database in their mind to figure out how to navigate the systems to access care. So I created what I call survivor-centric legal database to help people access care. But this is what's happening at the surface level. There's a much deeper need for spiritual healing for the level of violence that I witnessed and am exposed to in Chicago. And so what you see here are actually two formerly Orthodox churches. One is situated on the southwest side of Chicago, and the other is on the south side. The one that you see, the Buddhist meditation centers in the Little Village community, and it was formerly St. Nikolai Serbian Orthodox Church, which has since moved to Brookfield, a western suburb about 5 minutes from our house. All right, the parish was constructed as an Orthodox church. It was blessed, it was consecrated, and when the parishioners moved out of the city, the building was sold. And now it is a Buddhist meditation center, but where you see them, the two Buddhist monks sitting, there used to be an altar where sacraments were served. And then this is Mariam Mosque on the south side of Chicago on Stony Brook Island Avenue, and it is formerly St. Constantine and Helen Greek Orthodox Church, which is now in Palos Hills. So at one point in these areas in Chicago with these high rates of violence and so much need for healing, there used to be an Orthodox presence and a sacramental life occurring. And I want to share an example, a brief snippet from the life of St. Innocent that I believe speaks to what I am observing and living through in Chicago, and a call for us Orthodox Christians more broadly. So who's familiar with the life of St. Innocent? Yes? Okay. And do you recall in his life when he went to go visit an island where there was a shaman who had alerted other individuals on the island that he was coming? I see some nods. So when he first came to Alaska and was basically making his rounds on the former missionary paths of those who preceded him, he came to an island and was greeted by a group of individuals who said, "Hey, we knew you were coming because our local shaman told us you were showing up." And so St. Innocent had this curiosity and went, "Well, take me to your shaman." And he went and met with the shaman, who told him that since the last Orthodox missionary had been on that island, that he was regularly visited by two men dressed in white, which St. Innocent understood to be angels, okay? And that they catechized him, and he in turn was catechizing the residents of that island in the absence of Orthodox presence, right? In the absence of the sacramental life. And that so St. Innocent is taking all of this in, and the shaman asks him, do you want to meet them? And so St. Innocent, being the obedient pastor that he was, he wrote to his bishop, but back in Russia. So at that time, with the post having to go through winter and multiple ships, that letter didn't get to the Metropolitan until much later, and he got the response several years after that. But the Metropolitan basically blessed him to meet these angels, but after he received that response, the shaman had already died. Well, in the chronicle of this encounter, all right, in the book Apostle to the Americas, the interpretation of this was that now that St. Innocent had come back to an area where Orthodox roots had been planted, where the sacramental life had been offered, that the work and the necessity of these angels' visitation of the shaman was no longer necessary, that the missionary work and the sacramental life would continue, which it indeed do through St. Innocent. And so I want to draw this parallel, at least what I see in Chicago, but I believe this is happening in other cities, that in the areas that we used to have a sacramental presence, in which churches have gone to the suburbs for a variety of reasons, there are people who are still seeking the healing Orthodox and the sacramental life that Orthodoxy offers. When my husband and I started attending Christ the Savior Orthodox Church in Chicago, a wonderful parish, our priest came to us and said, how can our parish be a part of what you're doing? Now, our parish is in the Gold Coast of Chicago, a very affluent neighborhood, but Father John Baker, who's now in Rochester, Michigan, was bringing our parishioners into the communities to do different kind of projects. Thanksgiving meals, we did vigils for families who were bereaved, and the families were blown away by the prayers. They asked, how can we come to an Orthodox service? But they wanted it in their neighborhood, to ask for them, oh, can you go take 2 trains to get to downtown Chicago? It was outside their realm of possibility for them. And so I believe that in my city, in the neighborhoods that I work in, that there is a thirst for the sacramental life and the sacramental healing that is offered through Orthodoxy. And that my husband and I are doing our best to nurture that through our presence, but it is my prayer, and I'm asking for it to be your prayer at all, that it's someday and somehow one of our bishops will bless for a priest like Father Alexei or Father Paul to come and rebuild in where Orthodox roots have been planted. And I want to play a snip for you of the kind of beauty that my husband and I are exposed to in this work. So I don't want us to sound like all death and devastation, but in the middle of this, in the middle of the work that we're doing, what we have been privileged to witness and absorb is what I believe Orthodox theology in technicolor, and how people conceive their lives in pain and trauma in a way that is reconciliatory, that involves unconditional love for those who cause harm to them, and also what I call like universal motherhood and fatherhood. So Saint Marie of Paris used this term after the death of her daughter, all right, when she was describing her own bereavement experience, and she said, the way I coped was by pouring the love that I had for my daughter, that I could no longer put into a physical person next to me, into those around me. And so I'm going to play a brief snippet that concludes my brief presentation, happy to take questions, of an interview that I did. This is about 6 years ago. The context of this interview is that in one of the criminal justice commissions that I was involved in, an elected official said that we were voting on different sentencing measures, and he said, I just don't believe this is fair for victims, what we were voting on. And I thought, who's speaking on behalf of who in this context, especially when we talk about victims of violence? And so I went into the community with somebody who does audio engineering, and we did StoryCorps, but among families who had lost children to violence and families who had a loved one incarcerated for violence. And we asked them both the same question: what does justice mean to you in the aftermath of violence? So this narrative is of a father, right, who was formerly incarcerated for a violent crime, who has 2 sons currently on trial for violent crimes, and he's talking about his experience of violence and how he understands his work in the community. His voice is a little scratchy, so I wrote some of what he said, but it's about a 4-minute clip, and that'll effectively conclude this really brief presentation. All right, so let me pull this up for you. There we go.
And I went to prison trying to make sure they had a nice name before they won't get to the streets. But I know how easy it is to get up there out there for fast money. And that was that when we had time to everything. I was like, man,
do you want me to guide your question and answer?
I said, man, when the sun's gonna break. Because I have a father. I had him, I didn't know him. Met him once in my life. I lost my mother. I was in prison. And I'm saying to myself, my son got 40 years, one had 28 years, where would I be here? Would I still be here? I was watching father. Because I was in and out. But when I get there, I'm there. I try to be the best I can be to talk to them. When I'm not my active relationship, I make sure they went to school. I want to make sure they all and I go up to the school. They know not to ditch school, but I can play with them. I let them know, hey man, education is a must. Don't be like me, but I have a GED. Don't be like me. You know, don't try to be like nobody, be like yourself. It takes a toll on everybody who does this. I was taking it out. I go to the town, I just did it. But I got to be mindful. That ain't my fight. My fight is to try to help them get out. That's the biggest fight. When I'm telling you 28 years, his son caught the case. He's in juvenile right now. No problem. I see what's getting. Now, if you'd been out, it might have stopped. And you know, that's hurt him more than anything. So I gotta stay focused. And make sure you gotta try to help him. You try to help his son. Sometimes you get stressed out, don't get sleep, you thinking so hard and forget about yourself. But I gotta know one thing, and they keep telling me over and over, worry about you first. Then you have other, you don't want to happen then. So that's why I have to stay focused. Don't get caught up on nothing to do. I know how to do now, work by prevention. Been working with young people now for over 10 years. Say somebody else gets me more. That's my main goal, brother. You know, it's easy to get in, it's hard to get out. I work for the institution now. I used to work for 6'5". I used to be a bodies in Toronto. Bodies in Toronto, you have to go in and talk to young guys who in conflict. You don't want to know who you want, but you just want to know could we stop it because we hurt each other. You know, because you hurt my child. You hurt your own. And my kids out here, the one I'm living right now, they're my kids. They might not be my biological kids, but they are my kids. Some call me Pop, some call me the Reverend, some call me OG, some just, they got all different names, but I never get mad at them. Somebody needs to be a father, somebody needs to be an uncle, somebody needs to be a grandfather. Just keep talking to them. You ain't like that on show line. I know he's your daddy, but you need one in your life.
So I want to emphasize 2 things he said. He said he was willing, he had done prison time himself, but watching his sons on trial, he said, I wish I could do the time for them. Sacrifice his own remaining life and freedom so that his sons could have life. And then the last part about him seeing the community as his children and literally expressing universal fatherhood. Last thing I'll say that I could share is that he mentioned that one of his sons, who was looking at a very long-term prison sentence, had a son, his grandson, who was in the juvenile detention center. Well, just a year ago, that grandson was killed. And he was called to that scene in the community to his own grandson's homicide. So this is what I'm in the middle of. And I believe we have, as Orthodox, there's so much to offer. There's so much to offer. And I'm praying that in the same way that Father Alexi and Father Paul are planting and regrowing these seeds of orthodoxy, that the same could happen in Chicago. So I'm happy to take any questions related to outreach work, related to whatever else may be relevant.
Thank you, Dr. for that. So we're going to do questions. Kind of like last night with the Q&A. I don't think you need to line up, but raise your hand and Matthew or Kevin is going to bring the mic around. If you don't mind lining up, that would be better. So we can move a little faster like that. So yeah. So who has the first question?
Just wanted to ask the name of your website again.
So the street support one, so it's www.streetsupport.org. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Dr. Bocanegra. Pleasure